During this time, the Great Depression, there's not a lot of work, and so you're actually going to see an increase in migrant workers looking for jobs, traveling around state to state, also within state, looking for work. When they did find work, they often were forced to live in pretty horrible living conditions. They lived in very impoverished camps. People could often get sick because of those living conditions, and there wasn't much medical care available for them. These migrant workers were often indebted to the labor contractors who gave them work. So in many cases, they weren't living in good working conditions or living conditions. Child labor was also a factor during this time, as child labor laws were pretty much ignored, and children contributed to the farm labor in order to help their families. At this time, families were struggling. They were just trying to survive. There was not a lot of work available during the Great Depression. People were really just fighting for their own survival, and so even children were involved in the work effort. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the availability of work, or really we should say the lack of availability of work. We'll take a quick look at this problem in Texas, Colorado, and Southern California. So first, in Texas, the reason why there was a lack of availability of jobs is because the majority of Mexican Americans that were involved in migrant work were working on cotton plantations. But during the Great Depression, because of conditions in Europe, remember Europe is going through the Great Depression as well, there wasn't a big demand for cotton like there used to be. And so cotton farmers and politicians got together and pretty much agreed to pass the Cotton Acreage Control Law. Now, the Cotton Acreage Control Law pretty much is what it sounds like. They're controlling the amount of acreage, land, that could be used to grow cotton. They wanted to really reduce the amount of land that was used to grow cotton because there wasn't a big demand for cotton. It wasn't something that was going to generate money and income because there was no demand for it. And so they wanted to use that land to develop other goods or to industrialize the state. So there was a shift in the state economy, and this law is working towards making that shift happen. But that doesn't work out so well for Mexican American farm workers who were working on those cotton plantations. They were forced to leave, and many of them migrated to cities looking for jobs there instead of working in the fields. Others who didn't migrate to the cities actually would migrate to Mexico looking for farm work there. All right, so lack of jobs leading to migration in Texas, right, because of a shift in their state economy. In Colorado, you're going to see natural disaster, in a sense, take effect on the availability of work there. I'm talking about a drought that would last 5 years in the early 1930s. And this drought is really going to hurt farm labor, particularly on the sugar beet farms. And so basically this drought is going to hurt agriculture, and this is all happening during what is called the Dust Bowl. Maybe some of you have heard of the Dust Bowl before. Go ahead and explain what that is. And so in areas like Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, parts of New Mexico, they experience what is called the Dust Bowl. And so in a lot of those areas, there were natural grasslands. All right, and those grasslands were removed in some cases in order to start farms, right? To start agriculture in those areas. So they got rid of the native grasses and started farms. The problem was those grasses were basically holding down the soil and keeping it stable. So basically you have a period of drought where agriculture is not productive, and then you have heavy winds coming in, blowing away the soil. Okay, so the winds literally blew away the soil. There's huge dust storms that come as a result of this, and that is what's known as the Dust Bowl. And so it caused a lot of farm workers to migrate to other areas in order to find work. So in Colorado, a lot of Mexicans and Mexican Americans who were working on the sugar beet farms during this time were forced to migrate to cities like Denver, right? Denver being the main city there in Colorado. And so there in Denver, they lived in overcrowded living conditions. Disease spread because of those living conditions, and you basically end up having the governor of Colorado putting the National Guard at the border of the southern border of Colorado to stop any more Mexican migrants from coming into the state, right? Because cities are overcrowded and there isn't farm work for them. Okay, so again, a lack of availability of jobs there in the state of Colorado. In Southern California, you're going to have a similar situation where farmers start to decrease the amount of production, and so if they're decreasing production, that means they don't need as many farm laborers working for them. So a lot of Mexican and Mexican American farm workers who were working on those farms, you remember agriculture is huge in Southern California, they were out of work, and so again, you see individuals going to the cities, and so in the cities, if they could not receive enough aid, relief, public assistance, then you have some Mexicans migrating out of California and just going to Mexico where they could find work there. But not all Mexicans would migrate to Mexico. Many remained in the United States, and they, along with Mexican Americans, would face discrimination during the Great Depression as they looked for work and tried to receive relief aid.